Hello, I'm Dr. Fitzgerald. This is part 2 of a multi-part video on the global climate change argument I've asked you to reconstruct and critique. The image you see is a still shot of Greg Craven, the author of the argument. We'll now look at the possible results of the 4 logical circumstances we examined in part 1. These results will be physical scenarios, possible outcomes based upon our acting or not acting, and the presence or absence of global climate change. Once again, we have the same row headings and column headings. And in each cell, we will have a scenario based upon the logical circumstances we derive from these headings. The outcomes for the first cell, where we took action but didn't need to, is a global depression. We'll symbolize this by the letters GD. In the second scenario, we avoid a global depression because we didn't act and we didn't need to. There was no global climate change. We'll represent this best case scenario with a tilde GD, representing the denial of a global depression. In the third scenario, we have acted to avert global climate change, and we needed to, since it was truly a reality. So we have GD, but we avoid the other terrible consequences associated with global climate change, such as widespread famine, catastrophic weather, and political and social anarchy that would doubtless occur. We'll symbolize this by a proposition which conjoins global depression, GD, with the denial of the other terrible consequences, OTC, that will be spawned by global climate change. Finally, we have our worst-case scenario. We took no action, even though global climate change was a reality. In this case, we suffer a global depression, GD, in conjunction with the other terrible consequences, OTC, just mentioned. We're now in a position to bring together the logical circumstances and the scenarios in a set of propositions that are quite precise. Each proposition will be expressed as a material conditional, that is, an if-then statement. In the first cell, if we act and there is no global climate change, then we suffer a global depression. In the second cell, if we do not act and there is no global climate change, then we do not have a global depression. In the third cell, if we act and there is global climate change, then we'll have a global depression, but no other terrible consequences. Finally, if we do not act and there is global climate change, then we'll have a global depression and we'll suffer other terrible consequences. At this point, we've successfully symbolized the propositions in the grid. As we saw earlier, these 4 if-then statements can function as the premises for the argument, along with P5, the unstated premise that we must act to avert the worst-case scenario, and P6, the premise that states that we can avert the worst-case scenario by choosing column A. What's the conclusion of this argument? That we must choose column A. The conclusion is based upon the intolerable risks imposed by cell 4, which is the worst-case scenario. It can be expressed as the conjunction of a global depression, GD, and the other terrible consequences, OTC. But what is really important is to negate the other terrible consequences that lead to the catastrophes that define the worst-case scenario. So we have to avoid OTC at all costs. And according to the argument, we can only do this if we choose column A, that is to say, we act. My question to you, is this a valid inference? Do the premises entail the conclusion? And how can we prove it's valid? This concludes part 2 of a multi-part video on the GCC argument. Please proceed to part 3.